Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be making the Mexican chorizo part of our fry bread taco. But first, let me thank everyone who's watching the videos and who has subscribed and is sharing the videos again. And if you haven't already subscribed, well hey, fry bread tacos, that's a great reason to subscribe. Now, on to the ingredients. For our ingredients, we're going to need 2 tablespoons lard or butter, 1/4 cup vinegar, 1 tablespoon Mexican oregano, 1 bay leaf, a half a teaspoon salt, half a teaspoon pepper, 1/8 teaspoon clove, 1 pound ground pork, 1/4 teaspoon ground thyme, 2 teaspoons garlic powder, 2 teaspoons powdered cumin, and 2 teaspoons powdered onion. You'll need about 2 ounces of dried chilies. The smallest bag I could find was 2.5 ounces, so that's why that's there. Alright, starting with the peppers. Now, what I wanted to show you on these is, if they're really fresh, they'll be flexible and bendable like this, and if that's the case with your peppers, you're going to want to put them in the oven at about 250 degrees for about an hour to make sure that they're thoroughly dry so that when we grind the peppers, we don't have any issues. Once our peppers are out of the oven and cooled, you're going to want to break them open like this, and I'll explain that in a moment, but one thing you want to make sure you do is take out the stems and get a little bit extra around the stem, because the stem part gives it a sort of almost bitterish flavor, which you definitely don't want here. So you don't really need scissors like I'm using here. You could just twist and pull them off just fine, no problem. But again, just make sure you get a little bit below, and if you see inside of the pepper, you'll see sometimes the stem has a little extra part inside. Just make sure we want to get rid of those bits, because those are the ones that are bitter, and they'll add to what possibly is a small bit of bitter that we're already going to be adding. So let's talk about that. So the thing that causes the heat, the capsaicin in the peppers, is primarily on these types of peppers, and actually most peppers, it is primarily stored in the seeds. So if you look, you want to make it hot, you're going to use more seeds. The less hot you want it, the more you're going to make sure everything is de-seeded. Jalapenos have a really nice fruity flavor when they're de-seeded and have a very spicy flavor when they're not. So it's how you get that level of hot is going to be how much seeds you add into our blender along with the outsides of the pepper, which is going to give it a very fruity but also peppery flavor. It'll be spicy. It'll be somewhat spicy. This is actually going to be very mild for mine, though, because I'm not going to use most of these at all. And there's also another thing you'll do, possibly later, that'll add a little bit of extra heat, so you may not wish to add all your heat here. Now, of note with these dried peppers, too, if like this variety is California, and that heat range goes from 500 to 2,500, so mine actually turned out to be a little bit on the mild side, and I probably should have added the secret ingredient, paprika, a little bit later on, and there's actually a reason to use paprika. But as for the bitterness that I was talking about, that's actually the seeds also. So generally you want to add some heat here, but not enough to add a very noticeable bitter component. So that's why we'll be using a second type of chili powder later on to add a little bit more heat without the bitterness. Once we got all that separated, your dried peppers can actually be ground in an assortment of ways. I'm going to use a blender. Blender's probably the easiest. You could also use a coffee grinder if you have a spare one of those. Make sure you wash before you put coffee in there, because that could be spicy. Food processor, mortar and pestle, any of that'll work. If you're using a blender, I do recommend pulling it a little bit before it's perfectly dry, like 10 or so minutes. And the reason for that is, if it stays just a little moist, you won't accidentally pepper spray yourself when you open it after the grinding is finished. If you get it all the way dry, it will, on the other hand, also be very light powder and thrown around, and you'll have to wait about 10 minutes before you open the blender. Otherwise, you'll open the blender, stick your face in, and go, oh, that was a terrible mistake. Oh, and yeah, make sure you wash your hands before you go to the bathroom. One thing I noticed when I was going back to this recipe is that I had originally tried it with ground bay leaf, and I did not have any more ground bay leaf, and I did not find any at the stores. I just couldn't get my hands on any more. So I tested about 10 horrible methods for making your bay leaf crushed enough to actually not be a bitter taste in someone's mouth by accident. And what I found was to just take a small knife and cover your hand and the knife, because it'll be just dry enough to explode everywhere, but not dry enough to actually crush with a mortar and pestle. That's pretty much the definition of how bay leaves work, sadly. So just kind of chopping them underneath of your hand so they don't fly everywhere like this. And you can see this was the least painful and boring of all the methods I went to get the crushed bay leaf, and it And you do want them crushed and left in there, because when I've previously tried this with just having the bay leaf in while it was cooking and then pulling it out and throwing it away, I found that the bay leaf only really gets to certain parts of it without going everywhere, and then while bay leaf's a flavor you won't notice, you'll notice the lack of it. So you want to get them crushed up, and however you get there is going to work. If you do have pre-ground bay leaf, that's going to be about 1/8 of a teaspoon. Now, for the last thing you may have some trouble finding, Mexican oregano is not the same as regular oregano. So if you can't get a hold of Mexican oregano, what you want to do is take about 3/4 of a tablespoon of marjoram and about 1/8 a teaspoon of basil and mix that together, and you'll come pretty close. And we are finally at the mix stage. Now, this recipe is pretty simple on the mix stage. It's literally just dump everything in, except for the lard. So while I'm doing that in the background, I will explain some of the things that I'm doing here that I have not previously explained. So we need 1/4 cup of vinegar for this, and I used 1/4 cup for the pickling the jalapeno. In this case, we're going to actually take the pickled jalapeno, which I had already cut up in for the refried beans that we made, and I'm just going to take those extra pieces out, and I'm going to reuse that jalapeno-infused apple cider vinegar in this, and that's going to give it a nice fruity extra flavor, and it does taste great. That apple cider vinegar, even if you're not going to mix it in there, don't throw that away. That stuff is tasty. So normally with a lot of meat products, you may or may not be able to overmix things, and in this case, overmixing isn't going to ruin anything. Even if you overmixed it to the point where the texture was almost like pate, it's not going to ruin it. It won't be quite as pleasant in the mouthfeel. So you want to pull it just a little bit past where you would with ground beef, to where it all kind of just barely starts to become one mass versus the ground bits, with some of them still sort of clumping in small sections together. Alright, and with our marinade time up, we just need to place it in a pan. Now, your choice of pans could be any pan. In fact, this is a place where non-stick actually stands out as a nice time saver, because it's going to be essentially a wet sausage, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, the wet part. Because it's essentially wet or moist the whole time, it's not going to brown or anything, so cast iron's not going to help you here. Plus we have vinegar, so you wouldn't want to use that because it might hurt the seasoning layer. But like a ceramic would be fine. Anything literally is fine. But if you have non-stick, it's going to be a breeze to clean up, and you can just wipe everything out and light bit with the sponge and you're good. So if you do have that, that's the easiest way, but anything really works. The primary thing that we're waiting for to happen, and why we are essentially just stuck there kind of for 10 to 15 minutes stirring, you don't necessarily have to be there the whole time, but just in case, you want to be up right next to it. And the thing that we are looking for is we want to, every time it starts to look like it's heated up on the bottom, that bottom layer, after it's heated for about, 3, maybe 4 minutes, and then you can see that it's starting to render the fat and release it. And that's basically what we're looking for. And then each time you do that, you're just going to start stirring and breaking up pieces as you go each time you stir. And like I said, it can wait about 2-3 minutes in between each stir. You can't go far, but you can do other things that might take up your time. In which case, if you're making everything, then something else will be taking up a lot of your time right now. It's fry bread. Now let's jump forward to where we decide whether we're adding lard or oil or not. After about 12 minutes, I believe it was, it'll start to look like this, and you'll notice, okay, now the fat's rendering out, and this is again where if you have a 70-30 piece of pork mince, you're probably not going to need to add anything. Now what you'll notice is a lot of the water has left, but we're left with just a small amount of what looks like liquid, and that's the liquid fat. So we're going to end up having to add, in this case, a little bit of lard. So what I will generally do to make that and add that in is I'm just going to make a hole right in the center so that I can drop the lard down on top of that and have it spread out, and then as I stir it in, it'll sort of make a sauce out of it. The water content of the lard will actually evaporate out. We're not worried about that, but you do have to be a bit careful with how much lard you add, as it's typically only 12 to 18% water content. Now that water content will evaporate, but the majority of the fats in the lard will not. So it's not going to reduce in size much from here. And that fatty goodness there, as the lard is, or Olive oil, I think, worked the best outside of the lard. Just a quick note on that one. But that sort of fatty goodness is what makes this almost sauce-like exterior on the chorizo itself. So it's not super dry. It actually has a little bit of a moisture that is that fatty layer that's soaking up all of our spices and just helping us spread everything around. So again, if you have like 30-70 or 25-75 pork, you may not need this, but if you look down and you see it's kind of dry in there, this is where you would add lard or olive oil. If you don't have access to those, butter will also work. Pretty much any cooking oil would work, but if you have something that you feel would bring a nice flavor to it, that's a better thing to use. Now, once you have your lard or oil thoroughly mixed in, you're going to notice it almost disappears into it. You'll see a little bit of bubbling here and there, but it almost disappears into the sausage itself, and that's what we want. But that outer layer on all of the chorizo sausage itself is the best part that we need for when we go to taste it, because if we didn't do this, it would be too dry for the flavors to mix when we go and do our tasting, which is going to be here in a moment. Now, there's another thing you're going to notice that I start doing once I get to that point, and I think even a little bit before then. I'll start pushing everything into the middle of the pan and letting it sort of steam up and have that oil render down through it, and then I'll spread it back out and I'll form it back into another pile in the middle pan, let the juices spread out just a little bit, and that way that mixes our flavors once again, since you're constantly applying a trickle down of liquid. So there's probably another, again, it's going to take you about 20 minutes before this is going to be all nice and well cooked. So let's jump ahead to, again, the next part where we need to do something. Alright, once you've gotten to about this consistency here, with everything broken up kind of small, but still leaving some minor chunks, you're going to want to taste it and see how it tastes. In my case, I lucked out. The regular base seasoning worked perfect. Everything tasted great. You may need to adjust the heat, and this is where you would do that. And like I said, paprika, if you want to keep it red, will add a small amount of heat. Not a huge amount, but any red pepper will keep the color and add the heat you need at this point. If you need to add salt or pepper or really anything else, this is when you do it. And then this last 5 minutes of cooking is pretty much done as soon as you decide. So it's like, okay, it doesn't need anything. I can stop it anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes from now. Oh, hey, it needs a little extra salt. Okay, I'm going to go about 5 minutes. So once you finish that all up, you have made chorizo. From scratch, no less. Alright, our homemade chorizo is down, and the only thing we have left for our tacos is the fry bread. So, next episode we'll cover that. This recipe is, again, mild. You'll probably want to up the spices depending on your tolerance level. For people who are not in America, or the southwest especially of America, this is what we generally just refer to as chorizo, but it is Mexican chorizo versus a Spanish-style chorizo, which would be more of a hard sausage, more akin to the texture of pepperoni, if you're unfamiliar with it. So this is a sort of soft, wet sausage, and that would be a hard sausage. Now, the difference in two is there's actually a fairly significant difference in flavor, not the least of which is the saffron in the Spanish chorizo. But we will get to that in a different episode. If you were to be not using this for a taco like I'm doing here, typical things to serve this would be, for breakfast, you would do like a fried potato and chorizo burrito. Other times of day, you might mix it in with tacos or burritos of any type. I hope you had a good time. I hope you enjoyed this, and I really do hope you try these fry bread tacos. They are great. Have a great day and a great meal.